Welcome to Chai with Molly, a show where we celebrate diversity the Canadian way. I'm your host Molly, and I have been looking so much forward to seeing you this week. We have an amazing show in store for you, so stay with us. Today we have in our studio a very special guest. He is a Canadian whose parents came from Hong Kong, and he is going to help us understand what is taking place in Hong Kong right now. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here in the studio with us.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks for having me here today.
My pleasure. So would you please tell us, all of us have been looking at these images that have been shown on television about these young protesters, young students who are protesting for democracy. So can you give us a sense of what is taking place in Hong Kong right now?
Sure. Well, it's a very long story, and if I were just to simplify it into its simple roots, I would say that it started back in about 2013. That's when the so-called Occupy Central movement began.
Okay.
And it began at a local university there, where they were calling for democratic reforms to the electoral system. Mm-hmm. And what they're basically seeking is a means for the public to elect the chief executive, or what you may consider the governor of Hong Kong,
okay,
to be elected in by the public as a whole.
Okay.
Where it goes from there is a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
It becomes a situation because of how that becomes, and there's kind of no full agreement about how that's going to be handled at this point in time.
So now this discontent,
mm-hmm,
I guess, originates from the promise that the Chinese government made
right
to the people of Hong Kong when Hong Kong was transferred back to China.
Yeah.
Right? That Hong Kong would not be treated the same way as mainland China is.
Yeah.
Right? So give us a little bit of an understanding of that.
So to go back, maybe even a step further than that,
okay,
we can go back into when, under Chinese imperial rule, when they ceded Hong Kong to the British. So the British took over that, and Macau was also an example. That was taken over by the Portuguese as well, mm-hmm, as part of a concession in several wars that were fought.
Mm-hmm.
So they leased those I guess territories out to the European nations for a period of 99 years.
Yes.
So 99 years is approaching, and we go into the 1980s, and there's a general concern by the citizens who have kind of come up there during that time. Sorry, maybe I should backtrack a little bit. Between that period in the 80s, there was the Communist Revolution during mm-hmm that time. And Hong Kong became largely dominated by a lot of people who escaped from the southern parts of what was then called Canton, now Guangdong, basically.
Okay.
And they escaped. My grandparents were actually some of those people who left China to go to Hong Kong,
okay,
in fear of that government change. So they went over there. It went from effectively a series of undeveloped lands in Hong Kong to a very, very major metropolis that mm-hmm everyone's kind of used to seeing now.
Okay.
So in traveling over there, there started to become that disconnect. A lot of the people who went there weren't in favor of the communist rule.
Okay.
And that's fair. So in the 1980s, with the handover kind of becoming imminent, a lot of people started getting worried and started, speaking to the governor of Hong Kong, mm-hmm, the British, saying, hey, we're British citizens because this is British rule, mm-hmm, and therefore we want to stay here. We like our way of life, mm-hmm, but we're concerned about what's happening with China, with them being communist, and we want to make sure we're protected. So the British engaged into discussions with China and then entered into what's called a joint declaration that
okay
enshrined a series of rights
okay
for the handover, creating this policy of one country and two systems.
Okay.
So the same kind of policy exists with...
So now everybody knows that people from Hong Kong have done extremely well. They're affluent, they're really big business people, right? And it's because of the policies that were there, and I guess this is what the residents of Hong Kong are now looking for, a continuation of that, so their lifestyle can continue, right?
So, yeah, sorry.
Because I also heard them say that we are not looking for independence. We are not looking to have our own country. We just want to be able to govern our city.
That pretty much summarizes up what the attitude is, because there's a lot of other international aspects that I think, given Hong Kong's size and geography, makes it very, very difficult for them to do things like military control, foreign relations. As a very, very small, I guess, geographical area, it's very difficult for them to do that. And right now, as part of the joint declaration, those things are handled by China in that sense. And I also want to note that China also experienced a very large amount of growth. And you could attribute that to very strong government policies, because they are a communist country still. And as a result, they can be very directive about promoting certain business aspects. So that's why they've been able to develop economically in that sense. If I were to use a comparison for India, for example, India being a more democratic society, they are also pro-business, but because of the many different ideas and voices that come from the nature of democracy, they've been a little bit slower in developing. They've done very well for themselves as well, but whereas China has had kind of a, I would say, I wouldn't call it the invisible hand, but more of the more active hand in saying, this is what we need to do to move forward.
So now China has seen what is happening in Hong Kong, and knowing that China is for progress, for development, for economic prosperity, what could possibly be a concern of the Chinese government or the, as far as Hong Kong is concerned? Because they could light the way for them.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's kind of the concern that China's always had about this. And it comes back to what's called the Hong Kong Basic Law, which is their constitution in it. And it is kind of enshrines what was in the joint declaration. But it doesn't give a very clear direction as to how to accomplish those things. And that ambiguity kind of causes some problems for, which have arisen now. One of the things is that from the handover, the so-called guarantees of freedom are only enshrined for about 50 years right now. So what the goal is for a lot of people is to move towards more democratic reforms now and kind of get that going, so that way it can kind of continue on. It's kind of something that keeps going there. China's view is that it could lead to more, I guess, people speaking out about it in
it could lead to similar protests in other parts of China.
In the mainland. Now, now China has been making some progress in that regard. They usually aren't opposed to local media reports about corruption at the local level. So, a city councillor in like a smaller town took some bribes and built a faulty building was built. They're open to those things, but when it comes to the heart of control in Beijing, that's where they kind of start drawing the line. And if you look at media reports with things like CNBC and even BBC in China, when they start covering those protests in China, there's immediately kind of a blacked out portion of it. It just goes completely dark at that point in time.
So let's contrast this movement with a little bit of what happened in the Tiananmen Square. Yes, because I guess this conversation would not be complete if we don't have that conversation. So how is this protest different from what took place at Tiananmen Square?
Well, with Tiananmen Square, I believe that that protest was much more far-reaching. They were asking for very, very strong and far-reaching changes that
within mainland China.
Yeah, within mainland China, that were much more that were much wider than what's being proposed here. What they were saying in Tiananmen Square is bring democracy to the people as a basic right. As
a country, yes.
Whereas in Hong Kong, they're saying, well, democracy here about the chief executive, what we don't want is we don't want Beijing's meddling in that process. But the problem is that there's various student and democratic groups in China in Hong Kong that can't seem to agree on the method that we do. Basically, there's one group that wants reforms that's more like, say, if I were to use what we have in Canada, we had something like city council where when you go and vote, you check off a box for your city councillor and then you check off a box for who you want to be mayor. That's kind of what the I guess the bigger group in the Occupy Central wants. But there's other smaller groups that say, well, we don't need to do it in that manner. We can do it kind of more in line with what we have at, say, the provincial or federal level, where you vote for a certain party and that party then selects their leader, who then becomes the premier or prime minister. And over there, they were saying, well, there's other means that can do that. That's where the disconnect with the protest groups kind of come in. There's not really a clear voice at the top, which has made kind of negotiations with I guess, the central government a little bit more difficult.
Would that be in the way of them getting what it is that they're looking for, because they don't have a clear mandate as to what it is that they're looking for?
I think it'll slow down the process, and it actually helps Beijing's kind of mandate there, because it's actually, the longer it goes on, the more it's helped them, because very much so a lot of the big businesses actually took out ads there saying, hey, don't interrupt our business. We want to keep going on. It's better for the country.
Right.
But the employees of those companies actually took out their own ads saying, hey, our employers' views don't reflect our view right now.
Exactly. And it's very difficult, I guess, when you live in a democracy all the time, which is what people like me have. I grew up in India, which is a democracy. I live in Canada, which is a democracy. To understand why people would want it so badly, right? So we just take it for granted, right? A whole lot of people don't even go and vote because, okay, what's the big deal? But the rest of the world values it so much.
Right, and over there, their method of elections actually works a lot different than the way it works over here.
Okay.
Over there, they have about 70 people that are elected into their government.
Okay.
And out of that, 40 are elected by geographical areas. So they take up the city, divide up into 40 spots, and you get a vote for that. But there's another 30 seats that's elected based on function, and they're elected by the business community through committees appointed by the government. So in those situations, it's kind of a flaw. It's what they kind of consider a flawed democracy, because what we're used to, you and me, Molly, is that we're used to saying, no matter how big in business I might be, I could be a billionaire, I still get one vote. Now, I have other ways of influencing the vote through donations, through my contacts, through various things. But
hiring lobbyists.
Exactly, but I still can only make the one vote, right?
Yes.
But in China, in Hong Kong, I could potentially have 3 votes, because I could basically have my geographical vote to vote for that, and then I would have my functional vote as a leader of business to vote to vote for someone in there to select. And then also the chief executive is selected through a selection committee of about 800 people.
Okay.
So potentially I could have more as a business person, I could have more than one vote. But the Joe Blow,
a regular person
only gets one for his geographical area. So, but they still have the majority of the vote.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know this protest in Hong Kong has largely been influenced by our Canadians. So tell us how that is working.
So just to backtrack a little bit about the history of this, during the 1980s, during that time of uncertainty about China, there was a very, very large immigration movement into Canada from Chinese people in Hong Kong. I don't know, Molly, if you remember that.
I remember that very well. I know they came and they bought houses.
Yeah, you
Markham was sold overnight.
Markham, Scarborough,
Yes.
where I grew up was about 2/3 of my class were children of Chinese immigrants for the most part from Hong Kong. So that was the time in which a lot of people came over here. And so a lot of those kids who may have immigrated when they were young, or whose parents came over, they went back for various reasons, because there's family connections there, there's jobs, there's various reasons for them to go back. and they went back there because of work, because of business, or even because of
family.
Because of even family. They went back there, decided to work, and now they want that continuation over there. That like Hong Kong actually has one of the largest number of Canadians there, per capita. And in comparison, my old alma mater, Western University,
yes,
they have an alumni association over in Hong Kong.
Really?
To cater to those people, and routinely the dean of the school actually does go there to visit a lot of the Canadians who are there. So there's a very, very large Canadian influence over in Hong Kong. So that's why they want to see the same protections that we enjoy in Canada moved over there. But I think that this debate isn't over because of that 50-year kind of period. This debate I think it's going to continue on for a very long time.
Okay. Premier Catelyn Wen is going to Hong Kong for a trade mission, and I know there are a few other premiers who are taking trade missions. How is this visit perceived within the Chinese Canadian community here?
Well, I think a lot of the Chinese Canadian community here is looking for some international support for their cause and for their movement to largely maintain the way of life that they've been used to. For the most part, very much of what a lot of the community is focused on is the business, and what they want is stability in that respect.
Okay.
So I think what they're afraid of is that it's going to be a very very unilateral set of laws, a very big brother knows best kind of attitude that moves in there. I think that the fear, if I were to put it, is kind of the fear that's been put into internationally from, like, say, Dubai, where they're very afraid that there's this very Western, welcome to our world, do business with us, but there's still this kind of old world lying in the background that people fear, and that's not
so much and no more.
Yeah,
that kind of a thing.
Yeah, so what they don't want is they don't want that underlying fear. They just want to keep doing what they do, and continuing on with that way of life. Yeah.
Okay, and so how can Canada help? I know the people of Canada or Chinese Canadians who have gone back, I know they are being a great influence, as we've heard from you. Trade is being encouraged between the two countries. Is there anything else that Canada can do to precipitate this movement further?
Yeah, I would say that what the average citizen can do is write to your local MP and let your view be known. And Canada as a whole can basically lend support to I guess promoting democracy, because as a Western country, it's the foundation that underpins what we believe in here.
Yes.
And so there's very much a process that can get done. Now, as we kind of discussed, there's different ways to accomplish that, and no one ever fully agrees with. There's always dissenting people too.
Yeah,
and
that's democracy.
But that's part of the process.
Yes,
and one of the negatives that a lot of critics have had about the Beijing's interference is to say that the person that's the chief executive must love Hong Kong but also love the central government. So it's kind of against what we do here. Well,
that's hard to define. How do you define?
Well, yeah.
Those are very difficult things to be able to define and say, you can't say it's 1 + 1 is 2.
Right.
Like, how do you define something like
right?
this?
And so what a lot of people are interpreting that as is someone that will just keep their head down and take whatever is given to them. But what we're used to over here is we're used to the mayor yelling at the premier and saying, hey, you give us funding for transit or for housing or for whatever the case may be. And then we're also used to the premier yelling at the prime minister saying, hey, pay your fair share for our healthcare in this area.
And that's a healthy thing.
Yeah, that's all part of the process of what needs to be done. And if we don't have that, we wouldn't have a lot of the things that we have today.
That's
right. In our society. So.
Okay, so before we end today's conversation, give us a sense of the Chinese community in Canada. We know that it's a very significant number of people. How many people from China Chinese descent call Canada home?
There's a lot. I think within Toronto, there's several 100,000 already in the area. I can't remember the exact number, but there are several thousand. If we take a look around the communities, there's a lot of, one of the things that my father is involved in is retirement nursing homes
Okay.
for seniors, and they house several like quite a few. They just completed 3 buildings in Richmond Hill for that. So there's there's a lot of there's a very large following. The viewpoint is very different depending on the community, because there's some people from Hong Kong that are very much, hey, we need to protect those people. But there's also a lot of people that say, hey, look, what China's done with their business development, with their kind of active hand in development, is a good thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to have Hong Kong move into that, because if you look at places like Shenzhen and Shanghai and Beijing, they've all come up a lot more in the last 10 years. So they're saying, well, it wouldn't be a bad thing for Hong Kong to kind of ride that help as well from the center.
Does Hong Kong need that?
Well, no, there's some people from China that would say,
that's their point of view.
that their point of view is,
because from what we know, I've never been to Hong Kong so far.
Right.
One of the places I do wish to go sometime. But from what I have heard, and we understand from the reports that we receive, that it's a very progressive, very affluent, very progressive, very on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
Of technology, kind of, and we've seen that in the protests. These young kids, they have their technology.
They're holding up their cell phones instead of
Yes.
lighters and stuff. Yeah, well,
Yes.
they are. There's a lot of, there's always that, I'm going to call stereotype of, the very wealthy Chinese person coming from Hong Kong and stuff. Yes, there are, but there's a very large divide, just like any other major city. There's a very large divide between the between the wealthy there. Like there's people that are
the rich and the poor.
And the poor, because the social services, like what we normally expect, like with social assistance, housing, stuff like that, it exists, but in a very different manner than what we're used to over there. So there's very poor. There's a lot of, like in the street, there's a lot of panhandlers, a lot of people selling stuff on the subway. Things that we normally don't see over here. Basically, people sell stuff on the subway in Toronto. They're promptly removed from that. But it's slightly different.
So not a big middle class.
There is a middle class, but that middle class, the lifestyle is very different. Like the lifestyle is very much head down. You're working. You'll go to work at 7:30, 8 a.m. You don't come home until about 11, and that's a normal work day for a lot of people. They work 6-7 days a week for the most part, but it's a normal way of life. Just like in India, there's a lot of people that just they keep working, head down.
Yes.
But it's just
Well, in India, I can tell the middle class. Is growing. The divide between the rich and the poor is beginning to widen quite a bit. Right. So that's not what anybody wants. Every country is looking to increase the middle class, because that's where the safety for everyone lies, prosperity, so to speak. Now, where do you see this protest going in Hong Kong?
Well, what we've seen right now is we've seen it kind of quiet down a little bit, and I think it's in China's favor for it to kind of slowly drag on and slowly die out. Because
is that like a way of them, wearing them out?
To some extent, because it's like, for example, I don't know if you remember, there was the protests in Toronto about what was going on in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers group, and they did this thing where they occupied Union Station. They tried to occupy various streets, and then the protest groups also tried to occupy the highways. It was people tolerated it up to a certain point.
And then they didn't.
And then basically people started getting angry. They actually started yelling at the protesters while they were there. And I think that China is seeing that as kind of a method, as people get annoyed from not being able to go to their jobs and not getting paid. They start to get upset because they have rent to pay, they have food on the table they gotta put there. And because they can't do those things, they're
So they're hoping that their own people would turn against them, so
Right.
they don't have to come and take them out and look like the bad guys.
Right, that they're allowing public opinion to kind of sway
Yeah.
in their favor, and they're also using that kind of a lack of a centralized voice, because it started with one movement, but then as it grew a lot bigger than the organizers expected to grow,
Yeah.
and it kind of there was no central command. It became decentralized. So when they have to negotiate,
That's when dangers, come in, when you don't know who is in command and who's calling the shots and what is it that you want.
right. And so
Right.
what happens is when they go to negotiate, because the contingent is so large, it's very there's always different voices shouting about different things that they want done, or that this is the way it should be done, or this is not the way it should be done, and then that kind of creates a disconnect. So it makes it
It's harder for the protesters to get what they want.
exactly
Right, because the government can turn around and say, "Hey guys, go home, get it together among yourselves, decide exactly what it is that you want,
Yeah.
then come back."
Yeah, it allows the government to stall on
Yeah.
the item until it's kind of died out, fallen out of public light, and then quietly swept away for the most part. So and then I think that any subsequent protest would not have the same impact in international media as it does right now.
Right now, yes. And well, one of the things that has impressed almost the entire international community is the way this protest has been carried out. Majority of the people are just young students.
That's right.
And they're so organized, they're clean, they're not messy, they're not disruptive, they're not causing havoc like a lot of the protests normally do. So we're just going to watch it optimistically. We hope that democracy comes to that part of the world, and they come to enjoy all the benefits of democracy that we have.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, Brian.
Thanks a lot, Molly.
If tomorrow all the things were gone, I'd work for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be in Canada, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless you, Canada. From the shores of Nova Scotia to the forests in BC, Montreal to Winnipeg, from sea to shining sea. From Detroit we can see her above the USA, 'cause there's pride.
That's all for this week. I hope to see you again, same time, same place. But before I go, I would like to remind you that to be good and kind to a stranger is a good thing.